Okay. So, what we're going to do is just go through the very basics then of swap, right? And look at, in a very simple way, a fixed for floating type swap. Okay, and another term that's sometimes used for these very basic swaps is a vanilla swap. Okay, so typically when we look at swaps, what we're really looking at, we have two counterparties. And we had mentioned before credit default swaps, right? And obviously they're somehow linked to interest rate swaps. But the example I'm going to work through here, and we'll make a comparison then with the credit default swap, is an interest rate swap. Okay, so that's, and we're going to take it that it's very basic, right? That A pays B some fixed amount of interest, and then B pays A floating rate. And typically in these type of structures, LIBOR is seen as quite important. Okay, so we know LIBOR is the London interbank offer rate, and something like 90% of swaps are based, they benchmark against the LIBOR rate, London interbank offer rate. And the history here has been that London was seen to have interest rates that were less rigged. And if we looked at the way blue chip banks or double A rated banks, the rates at which they lent and borrowed at, that would provide us with some kind of a more economic interest rate, right? An economic rate. Okay, so that's a little bit the history of LIBOR. Now, LIBOR may be part of history going into the future. And part that might be explained that the LIBOR rate, we know that the LIBOR rate, there was some issues around LIBOR in relation to rigging, right? A number of the traders colluded to manipulate the LIBOR quotes to the British Bankers Association, who at one stage had responsibility for compiling the LIBOR rates. And it's lost a certain amount of credibility. Now, if it will be replaced by something else, it's not clear, but it's definitely something that's being considered. Okay, let's take a very simple interest rate swap then, right? That as it is. And let's take a look at, let's take an example then where, let's say we've two counterparties, A and B, right? A and B, right? A and B. And we have, okay, company A and company B. And they're faced with the following quotes, right? There's a fixed quote and there's a floating quote. And company A wants to borrow money, and they're told if they borrow fixed, they have to pay 12%. If they borrow at a floating rate, they would have to pay the LIBOR rate plus 10 basis points. And then B, let's say, is told if they want to go fixed, they have to pay 13.4. Or if they go floating, if they borrow at a floating rate, they would pay 0.6%. Okay. So in this structure then, we have two companies, A and B. We would say we might be able to explain that A wants something in particular, right? So generally speaking, maybe A wants to borrow floating, and we're going to say B wants to borrow at the fixed rate, right? So these are just preferences that they have, right? And the question then is that something that is it economic feasible to do that? And how would this scenario facilitate or motivate the two counterparties to engage in a swap? So a little bit of the thinking then would be, we have A and B. it would appear, even though A wants to borrow floating, it's definitely clear A has an advantage at the fixed rate. And we would say A has an absolute advantage and comparative advantage, right? So looking at this for a moment, right? A, okay. A has an absolute advantage and comparative advantage in borrowing fixed, right? So if we look at A here, it has an absolute advantage compared to B in borrowing fixed. Why would we say that? Well, A has an absolute advantage in borrowing in the fixed rate and the floating rate, because in each instance, the rate that A pays compared to B is lower, right? So if we take the difference between the 12% and the 13.4, B pays 1.4% higher than A, and on the floating side, B pays 0.5% higher than A, right? So in both cases, A has an absolute advantage. However, we would say that A also has what we might describe as a comparative advantage, right? We'll look at A for a moment, right? Paying 12%. A has a comparative advantage compared to B, and B has a comparative advantage, although not an absolute advantage, compared to A, right? Because even though A pays a lower amount of interest in both cases, which is consistent with an absolute advantage, we would say B has a comparative advantage in the floating side compared to A, because while B pays 1.4% higher than A on the fixed, B pays only 0.5% higher on the floating. So this is a comparative advantage, right? And again, if we were looking for the history here in terms of the terminology, right, we would go back to Ricardo, right? So it's a comparative advantage. Okay. Okay, now what's the background here? Well, the background is Ricardo, who was a noted economist, right, and a free trade advocate, pointed out that countries, he took the example of France and UK. He said, look, if France is better at producing wheat or better at producing wine, and then let's say Britain was better at producing wheat, then it makes sense that France concentrates producing wine, UK concentrates in producing wheat, and they trade the surplus. So this is a case where UK is an absolute advantage and France is an absolute advantage in their respective area. Then it makes sense that they specialize and they trade, that they exchange. But what if France actually has an absolute advantage in producing both wheat and wine, right? Does that mean then that UK shouldn't produce, should try to produce wheat? No, he said, look, it makes sense. It still makes sense that Britain concentrates in producing what it does, where it has a comparative advantage, and France concentrates in producing wine, right, and then trade the surplus. So even though UK could produce wine as well, it would do so very badly. It makes more sense for Britain to produce wheat. Whatever surpluses they create, then they would trade a surplus, and that is more productive and leads to higher levels of productivity. Now that's an old example, and it comes from Ricardo. Ricardo was a prominent figure in trading stock and bonds during the Napoleonic years, and he produced maneuvers a little bit like Richard Cantillon. Was slightly mischievous, made a lot of money. And the case of Ricardo, he retired and he became more dedicated to writing about economic topics, a little bit like Cantillon. There's a similar timeline and story, except Ricardo came later, right? Let's go back to our original example here with the comparative advantage. We would say, looking at this swap structure, we have A and B. A wants to borrow 12%, is quoted 12%. B is quoted 13.4 on the fixed side. A is quoted LIBOR plus 0.1 and floating, and B, who wants to borrow, is quoted LIBOR plus 0.6. Does it make sense for A and B to enter into a swap? It does. And how might we engineer that? We go back to the basic setup here. We have A, we have B, and we have the 12% on the fixed side and 13%, 13.4 on the floating side, and on the fixed side for B. And on the floating side, we have LIBOR plus 0.1 for A and LIBOR plus 0.6 for B. So B pays 50 basis points over A on the floating and pays 1.4% over the fixed. Is it profitable? If A wants a fixed rate, A requires a floating rate, and B wants fixed, does it make sense for them to engage in a swap? It does, and we use this idea of comparative advantage. Even though A wants floating, we will make them borrow where they have a comparative advantage, and B wants fixed, we will make them borrow here where they have a comparative advantage. So how does this work? Then see the potential profits available here. Let's say with the following spreads. We have 1.4% difference here, and we have 0.5% spread here. If we take the difference between the two, the difference in the spreads, this is in aggregate the total amount of money that could be saved from engaging in a swap. Let's say in the structuring of the swap, you have a financial intermediary who needs to be part of the clearing process and managing the credit risk, and requires a fee of 1.1%. Let's say to undertake that, to organize the swap, and to facilitate everybody is adhering to the agreement. This could be a 5-year term. Then we'll give them a fee of 0.1%. That would leave 0.8. And if we take that 0.8 and we divide it by 2, so if we take 0.8% divided by 2, that would leave 0.4. And that would get shared equally then between A and B. And each would get 0.4, and the financial institution would take the 0.1. Okay, so how do we structure in that respect? How do we then structure the swap? Okay, we could do the following. We could say, okay, let's set up A and B. And we would start off in a perfunctory way. Look, we will, on the floating side, play LIBOR. So A will pay the financial institution LIBOR, and then the financial institution will pass that LIBOR rate on to B. Okay, so on the floating side, there's no ambiguity. We simply pay LIBOR and receive LIBOR, okay, financial institution. Then we would say A wants fixed, and currently B would pay 13.4% fixed. So to give them the benefit of this 0.4, B should end up with 13%. Okay, paying 13% net. We would also would say, without doing, just reading, following in a very formulaic way, the approach here, in addition to, in a very perfunctory way, saying the financial institution should receive LIBOR and pay LIBOR, we would also say that B must pay LIBOR plus the 0.6%. And why is that the case? Because we are going to set up the swap in such a way that we make B borrow at its comparatively advantageous rate. And likewise, the logic here would prevail. We're going to have to make A borrow here at its comparatively advantageous rate, which is 12%. Right? That must be, and foremost, the design of the swap. We design the swap, even though A wants floating, we make them initially borrow fixed because that's where they have a comparative advantage. Okay, also we must ensure A should benefit by entering the swap, and initially their quote for A is LIBOR plus 0.1. LIBOR plus 0.1. A wants a floating rate. We'll say we'll give you the floating rate, but we must also make available the 0.4. So A should benefit to the tune of that 0.4. That would mean A's net position should be LIBOR minus 0.3%. Okay, then finally, what we've got to, in order to finish the swap, complete the swap, and to ensure that A gets 0.4% of a benefit, B gets 0.4% of a benefit, and the financial institution gets 0.1, we have to see what rate here is consistent. Okay, what should B pay the financial institution, so that when we combine LIBOR and LIBOR 0.6, that the net position for B is 13%. There's only one rate consistent with that, and that is 12.4%. Okay, so let's put that in and consider that. Okay, so if we take LIBOR, if you receive LIBOR, pay out LIBOR 0.6, then you're down 0.6, and if you pay out an additional 12.4, you're down collectively in aggregate 13. Okay, so that would net to 13%. And then to consider A's case, what rate here should the financial institution pay A, so that overall when we combine the 12% and this figure and LIBOR, that the net position is LIBOR minus 0.3. The only rate that works there is 12.3%. Now, how do we make that assertion? If you receive 12.3 and you receive 12, you pay out 12, you're down 0.3. If you pay out LIBOR and that 0.3, you're down, in net terms, LIBOR minus 0.3. And LIBOR negative 0.3, then it's consistent. A wants a floating rate. They're getting a floating rate. They originally would have been offered LIBOR plus 0.1. Now they're getting LIBOR minus 0.3. That's a gain of 0.4. The B, originally we said B wants fixed. Originally they were quoted 13.4. If they were to get the benefit of 0.4, that would bring them down to 13. This combination of the three rates nets to 13%, so that they're benefiting to the tune of 0.4. And then the only final thing we need to verify, did the financial institution, right, get 0.1 of a fee? And when we look at the rates, the LIBOR here cancels with LIBOR, and they received 12.4, paid out 12.3, they're up 0.1%. So they also get a 0.1%. Okay, and the swap then works. So key here, a couple of things important. There's this idea of comparative advantage. That's an old idea. It goes back to Ricardo. It's an idea that has helped, it's the basic principles governing or that motivate a good chunk of the advocacy for free trade, that countries that have not only absolute advantage but comparative advantage, if we observe that countries enjoy comparative advantage in producing some goods, they should specialize in that and exchange. The analog we can see in a modern literature here applying to swaps. And we use this idea of comparative advantage. Even though A wants to borrow floating, B wants to borrow fixed, we initially ensure that even though A wants floating, we make them borrow the fixed rate. Why? Because they have a comparative advantage on the fixed side. What about B? B wants a fixed rate, right? B wants a fixed rate of interest, right? We can see that here. But we insist that they borrow at the floating rate initially. Why? Because they have a comparative advantage. And because of these initial savings that occur because they borrow at their comparatively advantageous rate, we can use the surplus that they create the swap, exchange the rates, and then ensure that each party benefits commensurately. So A gets 0.4%, B gets 0.4% benefit, and the financial institution takes 0.1. So when we compare B's original quote of 13.4%, we can see here they're getting a net position of 13. That's a benefit of 0.4. And we can see here A's original preference for the floating rate, they were quoted LIBOR plus 0.1. Through the financial engineering embedded in the swap, we can bring that down to LIBOR 0.3, and that's again a 0.4% gain on position. Okay, so that's a simple explanation of a swap, how it works. It also, in many respects, is indicative of why, despite the fact we had a tremendous amount of turmoil in the swaps market, particularly credit default swaps, the same didn't apply to the swaps market, and it's an area that has continued to grow despite the setbacks in the credit default swaps market. Okay, let's leave that there.